she can jump in.
Glad to see all of you. Missed you last week, but glad to be with you again. I'm going to share the screen and we'll look at the next chapter of John. Move you over here. Perfect. All right, so, oh, here comes Lynn Stradley. I knew he'd come in eventually. Gospel of John. So 2 weeks ago now, we looked at the Samaritan woman at the well and talked about that process. As usual, as always happens when I talk about Jesus flirting or flirting at the well, like we talked about, I got a couple comments here and there from people getting anxious about that idea of Jesus flirting. My response is pretty basic. The story is told in the context of a dating and marriage ritual. Jesus enters into it knowingly and plays with the form. And so at the end of the day, for me, Jesus is human and he can playfully banter. If we want to call it playful banter instead of flirting, that might make people more comfortable, right? Some days.
Yeah.
Yeah. But either way, for me, it's not a problem because I think Jesus, being fully human, can flirt or tease or joke or do anything that we do without that getting too anxious. So without further ado, we'll jump into, we stopped, that finishes the story of the Samaritan woman, goes from it's chapter 4, but it's verse 1 through 42. So then we have this end of the chapter has a little bit of another story. So today we're going to look at the healing story at the end of chapter 4 and the healing story at the beginning of chapter 5. So literally, we've just finished, everything is done, and when the 2 days were over, that is, Jesus stayed for a couple of days in Samaria. He went from that place to Galilee, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in the prophet's own country. And when he came to Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him, since they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the festival, for they too had gone to the festival. In that case, we know it was Passover because that was the last festival that they had seen him at, or at least we can assume that. So it's not altogether clear. It's not on there, but that's most likely what it was. Then he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine. Now there was a royal official whose son lay ill in Capernaum. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and started on his way. As he was going down, his slaves met him and told him that his child was alive. So he asked them the hour when he began to recover, and they said to him, "Yesterday, at 1 p.m, the fever left him." Father realized that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he himself believed, along with his whole household. Now this was the second sign that Jesus did after coming from Judea to Galilee. So that's the end of chapter 4. I'll give you a couple quick things. If this story sounds familiar, it should. This is one of the few stories that is in the Gospel of John that also shows up in other Gospel stories. It more or less connects with the centurion's servant in Luke and in Matthew. In that case, it's specifically listed as the centurion's has a servant, and if you don't remember that story, it's very similar. Apart from the centurion shows great faith in Matthew's version where he says, "I know how this works. I am a person under authority. You are one with authority. If I tell someone to go, they will go. So if you will just tell me that my servant is well, then I know they will be well." Right? So in that case, Jesus is amazed with the centurion's faith, and the servant is healed. In this case, there's obviously some differences. It's not a centurion. It's not a servant. It's a father and a son. So there's a little bit different kind of approach. But what we have to name is the Gospel of John connects the second miracle with the first miracle. First, by literally naming it, right? Jesus shows up in Cana of Galilee again, and it says very clearly where he did his first miracle. So there's a direct connection there. Again, it's the third day. And that one they explicitly say on the third day he came to Cana of Galilee. This one's a little bit sneakier because it says after 2 days he went to Galilee. So that's the third day, right? If it's after 2 days, then there's the third day. But it's a little sneakier, but it's still in there. And then the pattern of this miracle is also very similar to that first one. In the first one, Mary says, change this water or help these folks out. They need more wine. Jesus refuses initially and then eventually does on the miracle of changing water to wine. Same situation here. The centurion, the father says, heal my son. He says, unless you see signs, you won't believe. It's the same kind of pushback, like, I'm not going to do this right now. I don't want to do this. But by the end, he agrees. So again, we see a similar pattern for both of these miracles. Again, these miracles then are literally numbered as one of Jesus's signs. And in the Gospel of John, we'll talk about this in a minute, there are 7 signs, there are 7 miracles that are very explicitly numbered. And so you'll see how that progresses as we go. All of those moments are very clearly connected. That is, the first miracle and the second miracle, John is drawing explicit connections between. That's before we get into what's actually happened in the miracle. John makes sure that they're connected. It's also connected to the woman at the well. If you remember, that Jesus talks to the woman at the well at noon. Now it is 1 o'clock. And this is a pretty common way in biblical poetry of connecting different parts by just saying, well, this poem happens at noon, this one happens at 1, this one happens at 2, this one happens at 3. And they're ordered in a certain way so that they are connected through that timing process, right? Again, John does this in a sort of sneaky fashion. We could literally say it was about 1 in the afternoon, that's fine. But there's that second level that John certainly is trying to do, which is to make these connections and say Jesus' ministry is all connected. It's not haphazard. It's not happenstance. There seems to be a direct and intentional way of doing this. Okay, so each story then is woven together in ways large and small. That is the intentional notation that this is where the first sign happened. And small, both signs, miracles happen on the third day. They're connected by the hours. And this is just brilliant writing. This is a great way of making these connections where we can read them independently, or we can pull that thread and start to connect these moments. There's 7 signs or miracles in the Gospel of John. But here's the real key. In the Gospel of Matthew, and certainly in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus very much doesn't want anyone to call him the Messiah. In the Gospel of John, he is fine. Anybody can call him the Messiah, but he doesn't like doing miracles. They frustrate him because he feels like it's a parlor trick or a magic trick, and the only reason people believe is not because of who he is, but because of the magic he did or the sign he did. So, the thing that we have to know, so while Jesus doesn't like them, we get the clearest indication is at the conclusion of the text, or just about the conclusion of the text, when Thomas famously says, I no longer doubt but believe, or Jesus says, do not doubt but believe, and Thomas says, my Lord and my God, to which then Jesus gives a very clear idea of what he believes about these signs and miracles, where he says, you have seen because you believe, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe. Right? This idea, it very clearly in the Gospel of John is, I'm recording these miracles because they happen. I'm recording these miracles because they matter. But, and it's really addressed to us as believers, right? It's really something that's addressed to us as folks who came well after and we couldn't see the miracles. Blessed are any of us who have not seen, who didn't get to meet Jesus, who didn't get to see the miracles, and yet have come to believe in him. So, the other side of this that we need to name is there's also a pretty clear movement outside the Jewish community over the course of these 3 miracles, right? Or these 3 moments at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. The wedding was likely Jewish. That seems to be clear. But the miracle is for everyone who attended. Everyone gets to drink the wine, not just the couple and not just those in the inside. So, like any wedding, you probably have people who were very faithful Jews, but they were living in a situation much like Jews are living now, right? Where they are not the majority populace. And so there were probably friends and neighbors and people who were Gentiles, were other folks. So there's a possibility, like any wedding, that there were all kinds of different people there. That's a little more vague, but most likely that was Jewish. And the Samaritan woman is clearly outside of Judaism. She is literally another group, another tribe, another connection. And then while he's not addressed as centurion, this man is from the outer edges. Capernaum was way outside of the typically Jewish communities, and most likely this man is a Gentile. We can't say it definitively, but there's some pretty clear sort of markers that say he's at least not physically in Judea, in the heartland of Judaism. So if this person is not a Jew, then they're at least not a Jew. Then they might, this person's most likely not Jewish, but if they are a Jew, then they're just way outside and on the edge, literally, like in a very literal, they live way out in the country kind of thing. So whether it's moving outside the Jewish community explicitly or just moving outside of the insular part of the Jewish community, there's definitely this movement away from being just a Jewish conversation. Very clear. So the stories are connected by references to one another and show a movement outside the immediate Jew. All right, so there's the outline, but I've literally not touched on what does it mean, or what does this mean for faith. So what do you all hear when you hear this story? Or and again, this is one that we've probably heard a number of different ways because of its connections. But what do you hear in this story?
What I wonder about, Bill, was Jesus doing this intentionally in the sense of letting people know that he was doing things differently than had been done in the past and with others who had not been seen as acceptable, I guess. Maybe the Samaritan woman, or I don't know about the father, but certainly if he was a Gentile, the father, that this isn't happenstance, I guess is what I'm saying. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is very intentional. And this idea that he very much has to go out to pull in those who are not typically connected. I mean, sometimes people will talk about, Jesus being revolutionary and including others. That's not always true, but I think it is fair to say it's true in these verses because it's the only time we see Jesus working with the Samaritans in that community that's not Jewish, right? Explicitly not. Mm-hmm. It's the time we see Jesus literally going out into the country or into these sort of farther away moments to pull in some folks that, if they're not explicitly outside the community, they're just physically distant from Jerusalem, from the heart of Judaism, right? So I think that's a fair reading, Roy, to say that this is very much Jesus saying, let's bring people in that are outside the regular. Outside the
right. Thanks.
Yeah.
To me, there were some echoes of the, I guess it's the encounter when Elijah cures Naaman, and he tells him to go wash in the river, and what? We have better rivers than this, and but he goes ahead and does it. And so we have an outsider here who's healed, and we have although there's some initial disconnect. I guess in this instance, the royal official is really more more initial buy-in, because he actually comes himself. He doesn't send anybody.
Right.
And certainly the gospel writer brings it all back to the idea of belief, that not only did he believe, but his whole household believed. And
Right.
I think we need to take belief in a pretty comprehensive sort of sense. That they get it, they bought in.
Absolutely.
So it's this same sort of notion of the mystical relationship, that they the desire, the love, whatever, to be in relationship with God is there.
I think that's very fair. It's definitely fair to say that both, sort of to combine both your point and Roy's point, both the sign of the appropriate response to Jesus for the Samaritans and for this household is that belief, right? They encounter Jesus in a very specific way, and they are lauded effectively for saying, and then they believed, right? The entire many came to believe through the Samaritan woman and even through their own conversations with Jesus. And then this whole household believes the same way. It is that same idea that belief and believing in him is the ultimate answer to what to who is this Jesus guy. They believe in him. Even if that belief is imperfect, right? There's also this sort of fudge room, I would say, that happens a lot in the Gospel of John, where they'll say they believed in him, and then the very next line they're saying, and who was he? Right? There's this sort of lines that happen every now and then where they say they believed in him, along with the whole household. They believed in his power. They believed, from this witness of this miracle. But that wasn't necessarily what they believed about Jesus, right? That there's not this perfect creedal statement about, oh, Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is one of the Trinity, or any of these things that we start to get hung up with on our stuff. It's not into that. It's much more into they believed elementally in Jesus, right? That he did something extraordinary and has changed my life. So therefore I believe in him. Whether I can define that in a perfectly theological sense does not matter as much as the belief.
So I have a few, I guess they're random thoughts about
No, it's great.
this passage, things that just pop into my head. So I like how the gospel writer used the word sign as opposed to miracle, because like a miracle sometimes is there's no explanation for this. What happened, But sign it shows that it's pointing toward Jesus. And then I also thought about the types of things that Jesus did. And I know we haven't gotten to some of them, but this was a healing. So it was, control over sickness and that sort of thing. And I guess we're going to see later things like, turning the water to wine, that was control over, elements in our physical earth. And then Jesus walked on water at a later time. That's I think it's in John. We get to that. So I'm just thinking of all the different types of signs or miracles that he did to show his omnipotence and control over all aspects of the world. I mean, even when he talked with the woman at the well in our last reading, he knew everything about her. So
Right.
The gospel writing is revealing all of that to us.
Yes, I think so. Absolutely.
One thing that I think is most interesting here is that Jesus was not near the son when he healed him. He was in another town. So Jesus does this from afar. Here's a miracle that he didn't even have to be present to execute.
Right.
Right. He didn't touch the child or,
Yeah.
I think that's something big.
Absolutely. Yes, you definitely get the portrait in the Gospel of John to both your point and to Marcy's point of this is a Jesus who knows not all, close to all, knows a whole lot, and has this power that transcends the sort of simple local healer or what a doctor can do or anyone else, right? I mean, these are truly signs, and John does use that word, like you said, Marcy, and very intentionally. Like, this is something that shows who Jesus is, more than necessarily to focus on the miraculous or the almost magic of it. Instead, this is intended to be a point that reveals something about who God is and who Jesus is. So I think both of those they're absolutely true. Those are the images that you get with John over and over again. That this Jesus is more than the local healer, more than one in a long line of messiahs that are more human than divine. You end up with all of these images very clearly put forward.
Bill, where would the Holy Spirit come into play on this?
It's a great question. The Gospel of John is perhaps the most clearly related to the Spirit, because Jesus will talk a good deal about sending the Advocate, sending the Spirit to us. But he's also very clear. It's between this and Luke are the two that are the most clear around the Spirit. But in both cases, they'll say that Jesus' presence doesn't preclude the Holy Spirit, but that basically Jesus has to go away before the Spirit can come. And that's sort of, in the Gospel of Luke, it's very much like Jesus has to die and be risen and ascend before you can have Pentecost and the Spirit comes. Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, when you have this kind of moment where Jesus is in one town and this boy is healed in another town, you sort of want to say, well, the Spirit moved sort of beyond that space and time to do that healing, right? That it's the Spirit of God in concert with Jesus doing that healing. We don't get the nuts and bolts, and it certainly doesn't label it that way. But I think it's a fair, if you're trying to give a more logical explanation, that probably is the most logical one, is to say that God and the Spirit are everywhere, even while Jesus is in a particular place. And therefore, it's through that other parts of the Trinity that the child is healed. Mm-hmm. I think that's comfortable. I don't think it's heretical. This is Trinity theology is very tricky. So I always have that asterisk. When anybody asks me about where does the Spirit or where is Jesus or where is God and these things, I give my most reasonable answer, but I can't guarantee that I haven't traversed one rule or another in those guidelines.
Sounds good to me.
Cool. All right, well, we'll look at the next then. So this, again, is the end of chapter 4. Now, the one thing we always have to name whenever we talk about chapters or verses is no one used verses until a monk was trying to help his fellow brother monks find the verses and find parts of the Bible. So he literally divided it all up in the Middle Ages. So if we had read this in the first century, it just would have been one long story without any breaks at all, and chapters and verse would have been not there. So sometimes it helps to remember that, because this story, in my opinion, certainly relates somewhat to the story before with the Samaritan woman at the well, because of the hour, right? It was at 1 o'clock, and it's right after the Samaritan woman's time at noon. But it's also much more of a story about healing in one of the signs of Jesus, one of these miracles of Jesus. And so the next story is another miracle. And so I sometimes feel like this is one of those stories that's really more connected. If we were to actually logically divide up chapter and verses, we probably would make this part of chapter 5 and have chapter 4 be a standalone chapter with the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well, right? But that's okay. Doesn't hurt anything either way. So we turn to chapter 5. This, some brief introduction. This features a healing, one of the signs, and a very lengthy discourse. Now, this is what the Gospel of John does. It's the model for almost all the remaining signs of Jesus, and for that matter, a lot of his teachings too. He will have a conversation, and then suddenly for like maybe 4 to 10 verses, and then he will go for 30 verses of just, and they're not always super clear. So he'll do something extraordinary. He'll teach in the temple. He'll heal someone, and then spend a lot of time talking. Sometimes about the miracle, sometimes about the response to the miracle. That is, people who don't believe him or doubt him or question his intent. And sometimes it's just a random riff about God. All of them are the same, though. They tend to be mystical and cyclical. That is, almost all of them have these moments where something like I'm with the Father and the Father is with me, and we are together as we seek him who is before and after. And you sort of get in this very, and again, it's mystical, it's cyclical, everything is trying to relate to each other. And a lot of ways, while it is discourse and while it is written in a paragraph form, it is almost poetry in a sort of spoken word poetry kind of approach. So it means that a lot of times when people try to analyze them, they start to fall apart really quickly, because I don't think they're really meant for analysis. They're meant to help us believe. Or even more, to say it differently, I think in a lot of ways, Jesus is trying to use human and finite language to help us explain or examine or engage with the eternal and divine. And so it's always going to be, language is always going to fail us a little bit, to say the least, much less getting all into it. All right. Today, we're just going to look at the first half. We're going to look at the healing, because for chapter 5, I think it's the first 15 verses or so are the healing, maybe 20. And then there's literally like 28 verses of discourse that get very, very confusing quick. So I figured we'd connect our healing stories, talk about that, and then we can try our first discourse next week and see how that goes, because it's a So after this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And we don't know which festival it was. I'll pause right there. The last festival that was mentioned was Passover. If that's true, then the next festival of the Jews would be Pentecost. That's always a surprise to a lot of Christians. They think that Pentecost is Christian, but Pentecost literally just means 50 days. And 50 days after the Passover is the Feast of Pentecost in Judaism. Possible that's what this is, but they don't actually say it, so we don't ultimately know. It's okay. It's what it is. I think we can take away from it is, once again, Jesus is a good Jew. He's while he's going out to groups outside of the Jewish community, there was a festival of the Jews. So what does a good Jew do? They go to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival, right? To offer their sacrifices and to worship. But so now to jump in, Jerusalem now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there's a pool called in Hebrew Bethsatha, or Bethsaida, or Bethesda, depending on which versions you want to do of that translation, which has 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat." And at once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. Now that day was a Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been cured, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." He answered them, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Take up your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take it up and walk'?" The man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you." man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews started persecuting Jesus because he was doing such things on the Sabbath. I'll pause for just a second and say there's a little bit more of the story, but I want to pause just right here because this is one of those things that people get confused about because it gets into conflicts within Judaism, but also the way Christians have perceived Jews, and especially some really bad preaching. So a couple of quick points. This idea of working on the Sabbath is critical in Judaism. It comes from really the Sabbath day is holy, right? You keep your Sabbath day holy. You should not work, and your slaves shouldn't work, and your wife shouldn't work, and your animals shouldn't work. No one should work on the Sabbath because God rested on that Sabbath. Critical in Judaism. It's a very, very important day. It's how you honor the day is by not doing the other things in the world and by setting it aside for God. All right, so that's the rule. That's the easy part, hopefully, that we can all understand. It's also been a big point of being misunderstood. So there's a couple of ways that's misunderstood. First, in Judaism, and you can talk to any rabbi you'd like about this, but this is very much how Jewish tradition and law works. You don't simply follow the law. You do what is called, you build a fence around the law, okay? So if you know, for instance, that it's critical to keep the Sabbath, to not work, and you don't just say, okay, I'm not going to go to work, I'm not going to go and read a legal brief now and do that work. They'll literally, to create a law around that, they'll say, well, then you don't even go to the office, right? Don't go to the office so that you would be tempted to read a legal brief and do the work. Or is work to start to pack your bag, to get ready for work, to do that, right? This is the idea that Judaism has created, is the law is so important that you want to prevent yourself from being tempted to break that rule, okay? It's actually pretty brilliant if you think about it. If I know that there's a certain rule and I'm not supposed to do something, then how do I make sure I don't accidentally trip into doing it, right? I mean, that's the idea and intent behind this. Jesus is likely doing the same thing in Matthew 5:27 and this is the quote, you've heard that it said, do not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman with lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart, right? You can't just say, do not commit adultery. Jesus is saying, build a law, build that fence around that law so that don't even think about it. Don't even start down that road, because if you start down that road, then you're already going to be getting yourself in trouble. This is the heart of sort of Jewish thinking and tradition around the law, is it's not enough just to say, don't commit adultery. You have to then also say, then don't lust after that person and don't put yourself in a position to lust. And then this is where in Orthodox Judaism, they'll say, well, then women should wear certain clothing and men likewise should wear certain clothing so that there's not that temptation to lust. It's all done from this place of wanting to follow the law and not wanting to get in a situation that you would break the law. Okay, so that's one thing to name about this story today. It's not a big deal that the man carries a mat. There's no commandment that says you shall not carry a mat, right? But there's this idea that you're preparing for work. If you're carrying a mat, you're working, you're laboring on some way by carrying the mat. Or perhaps even this man, in some cases, maybe people were working. If you were a beggar, then that was your work, right? You laid out your mat, and you sat on your mat and asked for money. So that could be construed as preparing to work. That's their concern when they say to the man, why are you carrying your mat? You're not supposed to do that on the Sabbath. It's a legitimate conversation within Judaism and probably should be Christianity, frankly, but that's sort of where it comes from, right? Now, that said, any rabbi worth their salt will tell you that a commandment to heal and preserve life is the ultimate commandment. That's it. If you want to talk about, like when we talk about gradations in Christianity, we'll say there are venial sins and mortal sins and all these different ways of ranking sins. Judaism does the same thing, but they will say the most important commandment is to preserve life, is the preservation of life and of caring for people. So hospitals, of course, should be open on the Sabbath. And if a doctor sees a man bleeding in the road, then he better stop what he's doing and get to work to save that life. And if that violates the Sabbath, it does at least fulfill the more important commandment of to take care of people. All right? So some of these conversations that they have in Judaism where they'll say like, oh, you're not supposed to heal on the Sabbath. Most rabbis, probably in the first century and the 21st, certainly in the 21st century, say that's a ridiculous argument. No rabbi would say that. They would say, really, the guy healed someone. He did good work. He helped someone out. That's not a sin. That is not something to have a problem with. If anything, the issue speaks then more to how they feel about Jesus's power, right? This is a question more about, not about the law as much as, oh gosh, this guy seems to have a whole lot of authority and power. This is something we're not comfortable with, more than it is about the law itself. And it's important to name all that, because what happens a lot of times in Christian communities is to say, oh, look, Jesus came to turn back all the Jewish law and we can ignore all that kind of stuff. But that's not at all what Jesus says. In fact, Jesus is really clear in all the Gospels that he came to fulfill the law, not to destroy it or replace it or any of those kinds of things. So if Jesus says that's what he came for, then we have to probably pay attention in the same way too. I'm going to pause there. Questions about Jewish law? I can't answer all of them, but I do know that this is an important thing for us to have the conversation as Christians about, because there's been a lot of teaching in Christian communities about how the Jews are the bad guys because they accost this man, or the Jews are the bad guys because they are persecuting him.
Is the author trying to stir things up by reporting that?
Well, some of it is that, certainly. This is what we sort of talked about a couple of different times, is it's pretty clear, and most scholars are positive, that the Gospel of John is speaking to a community that had been kicked out of the synagogue, had been, because they believed in Jesus and believed he was the Messiah, that they had been pushed out. So some of what we're dealing with is a family squabble kind of thing, to say like, the Jews, and not like, oh, all Jews are evil, but that group of Jews doesn't like Jesus. It's more of a family squabble kind of thing. It'd be like if Episcopalians said, those Anglicans said to do this. Well, technically we're Anglicans too, but the terminology could be used to refer to the group that broke away in the last decade over gay marriage, right? And biblical authority. So he's doing it. There is a polemic there that he's intentionally, I think it's fair to say that the gospel writer is trying to blame a group of Jews for bad interpretation, but not all Jews. I think that's the distinction. But
You know, I remember as a child that the Sabbath day was supposed to be more holy than it is now. I mean, we didn't know, there were no stores open. And you had, you know, we did not do anything on Sunday except go to church and possibly visit family members. And I know my grandmother always did, if we were going to her house, she did all of the preparation, all of the cooking, but she did it all on Saturday.
Oh, wow.
She did not cook on Sunday. She had everything ready for Sunday. So, and that was supposed to be a day of rest. So,
right.
Yeah, it was very different even at that time.
Yeah. My favorite, a good friend of mine, well, Chuck McMillan, mom and dad, y'all know him, but a good friend of mine lived in a largely Jewish neighborhood and community, and he would always laugh that on Saturday, the ladies would typically call him and ask him to come over and turn on the oven because they cook. But he was
turn on the, oh no.
He'd come over and turn on the stove or turn on the grill or whatever so they could cook. They were allowed to cook, but they couldn't start a fire.
Oh no.
Goofy little things like that happen. They're just funny.
That's funny. So they get the Christian guy to come over and turn it on.
Exactly.
That mean he's going to hell and the Jews are?
I don't think anybody's going to hell. I think it was just trying to get around those rules.
He was doing a good thing.
So for the end of that story, or at least the part that we're going to look at, Jesus answered them as they're complaining about him healing on the Sabbath. Jesus answered them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." For this reason, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he was not only breaking the Sabbath, but was also calling God his own Father, and thereby making himself equal to God. So I think this is the other side of it. When we hear all the story, that it's not just a Sabbath question, that probably what they're more upset about is Jesus calling himself God. It's a blasphemy question. But that said, what do y'all hear in this passage, in this healing story, which again, this one has also mentioned, there are variations of this. Matthew has one of the longer versions of this story of the healing the man by the pool of Bethsaida. We'll hear in this healing. So one part, there's this whole stirring up the water. You've probably heard this, but the tradition in a lot of those, in a lot of these, and you'll hear this story in a variety of different gospel readings, was if you were at a pool of water that was still, then when the water was stirred up, when there was a bubble in the water, or we've all seen this, right, where there's sort of a ripple underneath the water, that the tradition in Judaism and in Christianity, for that matter, was that it's the touch of an angel's wing would cause that water to stir up. And therefore you could be healed if you were the first person in the water, or you were the first person to touch the water after that moment, that there was a healing property to the water when it had been moved. And actually, this is what a lot of times people would call living water at times as well, right? That the living water was that water that moved and was healthy. They knew that still water could get fetid, but water that moved and been stirred up had that quality of healing and of life. So part of this story that the sick man is saying is, hey, I'm here, I'm trying to get in, but because I'm paralyzed, I really can't get in the water. No one can help me in there. To which Jesus then ignores the water completely and just says, okay, you're well, we're good. I will say this, one thing that always strikes me in this particular telling of the story is there in verse 13, the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had disappeared in the crowd that was there. You get this really clear idea in John that Jesus is divine, that Jesus has authority, that Jesus is different. But at the same time, Jesus doesn't glow. Right? I mean, he can still get lost in the crowd. He's still human. He's still like everybody else.
Yeah.
He's a regular guy, and he gets healed, and he's like, I don't know, that dude, he walked off. I don't know where he went. I mean, you have an almost comedic moment of, even though this man has literally been healed after 38 years of being paralyzed, Jesus is still average enough or regular human enough that he can walk away and get lost in a crowd, right? There's a certain anonymity to it that if you watch a movie, everybody already sort of Jesus walks in and everybody parts so that they can see him, and he almost has a glow around him, if not an actual halo. But this image is much more of just, hey, it was that guy. I don't know who it was.
Bill, I wonder if around this time, maybe among the Jews, maybe not, were there other people who were doing what were called miracles at that time?
I think there are people who would call them miracles, absolutely. Absolutely. The people who witnessed some of this would call it miraculous or a miracle. certainly use that term in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I think the Gospel of John is just very intentional about saying signs, like Marcy said, so that we can say, this shows the way to Jesus. This is something more to point us towards God, and reveal something about God. But I would imagine these people would still say it was miraculous and it was a miracle.
Right.
Been healed.
So
The man who is healed is.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn. Sorry.
I was going to say the man. Thank you. The man who is healed is not as sympathetic character as often those who are the beneficiary of the signs. You know, he doesn't. You know, Jesus asks him if he wants to be made well, and he doesn't say yes. He just starts with this explanation of how, you know, people always beat him to the spot when the opportunity for healing is present. You know, but that doesn't deter Jesus. He heals him.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it seems like it's sort of a prompt to set up this sort of mini trial of Jesus, you know, with the religious authorities, you know, sort of with the healed man being sort of the proxy, and he just shifts the blame to Jesus as well. You know, he's the one who healed me. Yes, don't look at me. I just, you know, he just told me to get up. He told me to carry my mat. That's what I did. And then he goes on to say, you know, the gospel writer says, now the man who had been healed did not know who it was. And so, you know, I think we have to think about all that's involved with the use of the word "know" here, and you know, where, you know, before, you know, we're told that the religious official and his family all believe. Here he says, I didn't know who he was. And you know, and then we have this curious comment later by Jesus: "See, you have been made well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you."
Yeah.
You know, again, to me, it's like, you know, he's a prop to set up this continuing interplay between those who want to be so fixated on the rules, you know, and the narrow interpretations of right and wrong, you know, instead of on what's about love and wholeness and, you know, life with God.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, this man is definitely deep in his victimhood, right? I mean, he's sick and a victim. Also, like you said, do you want to be made well? Well, no one will help me. Like, I mean, he's pretty down deep in that in the dumps, in that victimhood. So, yeah, there is this other layer of Jesus helping, even though, well, the previous people almost had to beg him to try to help. This one is the exact opposite. It's sort of Jesus has decided to help, and this man's going to be helped regardless.
I really like that whole conversation we just had, and that Lynn sort of brought it in perspective for me. But I was thinking about that too. Why this man? And I was looking at the first verses. I mean, Jesus was the one who initiated the contact, and it talked about a lot of people being there. And then this man said, "Oh, other people beat me to the water at times." So why did Jesus pick this man? Was it because he knew he had been there 38 years? And so it made me also think, my mind wandered to, well, the last shall be first. You know, maybe he was picking somebody that knew how to, And and that kind of plays into what Lynn said. He purposely picked this person, and it played out the way it did.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. Why this man? And man, I'd be mad if I was the guy sitting next to this man, right?
I know. Yeah. Why him? Why not me?
Yeah, I was thinking, how did this guy score the golden ticket?
Yeah, really.
Oh, yeah.
I think 38 is a curious number. It's like, well, we know that 40 is a really long time and a really meaningful number. So we don't really want to elevate it to 40 years. but we want you to know it's been a long time anyway.
Yeah. It's a great story. It really is a great story.
It is.
Details. But details like a lot of times in John where we go, why 38 years? Why this guy and not another guy? Why did this guy not ask Jesus his name or try and figure out who he was, right? I mean, there's lots of these sort of exchange questions that
And why did Jesus tell him not to sin anymore? That sort of made me think, oh, he'd been sick because he had sinned. I mean,
right.
You hear that sort of theology all the time, and just wondered if that related to it.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that theology either. that Jesus is the one saying it, so you have to wonder what it means in that situation. All right. Yeah, so 28 verses of discourse after this, and like I said, we'll look at those next time. An hour, so we're perfect. We're good. We'll pause here before jumping into that more complex conversation. So next week we'll look at the end of chapter 5. We'll look at that discourse and try to start to unwrap that package. I would encourage you to read the entirety of chapter 5 if you get a chance, and read it slowly. See if you can discern what's being said. And I really think in the Gospel of John personally, there's always this invitation to go deeper, to try and understand a little bit more. How is John inviting us to understand more? How is Jesus inviting us to understand more about who God is? That relationship there. We'll talk about signs a little bit more and their meaning in the Gospel of John next time too. Like I said, there are 7 of those, and they get used in specific ways. We've now seen 3 of them, so we'll unpack that a little bit next time. Otherwise, we'll just see y'all next week. It's great to see y'all. Anybody have anything else to share or pray on or think on? Good to see you. Y'all have a great week, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Good to see everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.